recording. So we will be recording. We will share this out with everyone. So welcome to our annual trauma-informed care training. I just want to cover a few quick things before we get started. So we are going to keep everyone muted, and we ask you to mute yourselves unless you're asking a question. We encourage people to use the raise hand function on Zoom because there's like going to be probably, well, there's already 116 people. We can't see all the screens. So use your little raise hand function if you have a question, or you can put things in the chat, and we encourage you to write questions or comments in the chat. We're going to be monitoring that as we go. Just some training norms and agreements. So we ask you to respect the trainers and attendees. Make space, take space, and number 5 is acknowledge power and privilege. This is really about just being mindful of yourself and your identities, and also sort of your personality. Do you tend to be a big talker? We encourage you to maybe like try and hang back and make space for other people. If you tend to be kind of quieter and shy, take a risk. Even if you don't want to like show your face or say something, ask a question or make a comment in the chat. And share the mic is again sort of about that, sharing the space. Just a quick note about these trainings. So we do monthly trainings. It's always the second Monday of every month, unless there's a holiday. And then we move it from 10 a.m. to noon. And we've started making this a regular schedule so that you all can schedule around this, because these are required for direct service staff and program managers, but they are also open to anyone. So if you have folks in sort of like adjacent fields or people that are just curious, you're welcome to invite them. They're all free. And we do different topics every month. Many of them are relating to HUD requirements or state requirements, but a lot of them are also just useful and practical and will help us all do our work better. With that, I'm going to turn it over to, just again, a little bit about requirements. Goals of this training specifically is to understand what it means to be trauma-informed, explore the impact of trauma from both a client and a service provider perspective, and teach you all key principles of trauma-informed care, including the role of cultural humility, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and how to use them in your daily work. And part of why we're doing this is we have it in our CoC written standards that we want to have a trauma-informed approach. So if we're requiring to use that, we want you to know how to do it. Shelby, I'll punt to you for a second.
Thanks, Jamie. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Shelby Ferguson, Continuum of Care Administrator with H3. On for my usual spiel, just making sure you all know that this is a required training if you're a CoC funded or contracted provider. Please make sure you have at least one staff from your program or agency attend. We know you might not be able to send every single person, but we do want to see every agency here. And then we do talk about it during quarterly meetings, making sure that you all had attended the trainings. And if you haven't, we will have a discussion about it. Thanks.
All right. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to turn the training over to our amazing folks, Ariana and Kate, to do our training today.
Excellent. Thank you, Shelby. Thank you, Jamie. Happy to be here with you all. So yes, we're excited to talk to you about or introduce and talk a little bit about what it looks like to use trauma-informed approaches in the work that you all are doing with the folks that you're serving. And so really excited to hear and learn from you all. I just want to reiterate everything that Jamie said about, wanting folks to participate. We're going to give you several different options to participate with us, including raising your hand if you want to speak out loud, using the chat. And then we actually use a separate tool to do some polls and some kind of ways for you to kind of anonymously share some of your thoughts. So when we get to that, we'll kind of share with that, but it's just a link that you can use as well as continue to use the chat for folks. So before we kick off too much into content, just want to introduce ourselves. So my name is Ariana Saunders, or you can call me Ari. I go by Ari as well. I use she, her pronouns, and I work with the training center at CSH. I've been with CSH for 4.5 years, almost 5. And before that, I also worked at the county here where I'm based at Las Vegas, Nevada. So I worked for Clark County in social services, where I also ran a supportive housing program, some other things. And before that, I also worked directly in supportive housing as both like a leader and doing direct service. So really excited to be here with you all. I will say personal experience, I feel like for me, when I first learned about trauma-informed approaches, it was very validating in the work that I was doing. And so I'm hoping that you also experience that too. A lot of this are things you probably already are doing. This hopefully just gives you a framework and kind of reinforces some of that to really just what I like to say is just, treating other humans like humans and just being compassionate to recognize all of our experiences shape us and warrant, the respect that we all want. And so happy to be here with you all. I will turn it over to Kate.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ari, and thank you so much, Jamie and Shelby. So nice to be here with all of you. My name is Kate Bitney. I also work for CSH. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm joining you from just south of Seattle up in Washington State. This is one of my favorite trainings to do, and I'm just delighted to be back with you all again. I think I last was with you in maybe a couple of years ago, 2, 3 years ago. And just, yeah, echo everything Ari said. Just appreciate being here. I'm a firm believer that we all have something to learn and we all have something to teach. So just appreciate all of you being here, being learners as well as teachers in this space. And I'm looking forward to all the engagement.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Kate. So that's a little bit about us. I love that you all are like introducing yourselves in the chat, and I've taken a quick scan of like kind of who's in the room. If you guys will just humor me and use the raise hand feature, just really curious to hear. Do we have any folks that are on that are in a leadership position? Any leaders in the room? A couple hands raised. So you're like a supervisor, maybe you're a leader, director of some sorts. Welcome, welcome. Do we have any folks that are, it sounds like most folks are in the service side. Do we have any folks that are doing operations or property management and supportive housing or anywhere in there? You can raise your hands. Couple, handful. Yay, welcome. We love all folks. And then I feel like this is going to be the biggest hand raised. So I'll just ask folks like who's doing support services? Who's offering direct services to folks? See some because I see we have housing navigators. I saw we have a couple peer specialists, which is amazing. More and more stuff. All right, we figured that might be the majority of folks in the room. And if it looks like we also have like site coordinators, other coordinators, care coordinators. I'm assuming some of that's direct service, some of that might be just administrative or supporting just the overall program. So all are welcome. I just, we asked to say that just to get like an idea of who's in the room, but also so you all know who's in the room with you. As Kate said, we all have something to teach. We all have something to learn. And a lot of it comes from our own experiences, personal experiences, but also professional experiences that is often guided by the role we serve, right? But a lot of this we feel like applies to everyone. As we said, if you're interacting with other humans and whether you're doing direct services or helping them pay their rent, the idea is, or helping them with repairs in their unit, the idea is this is going to help guide us all in how we can better understand folks and their behaviors, but also really treat them with the dignity and respect that they deserve. And in a way, hopefully that's super helpful for folks. So thank you all for engaging that with me. And yeah, folks are learning to unraise their own hand, but I'm, going to assume some of the hands that are still raised are based on my polls. So I'll keep us moving. So what we're going to cover today, as we said, we're going to talk a little bit about how trauma shows up. So this could be a course of its own, but we're just going to give you a little kind of background about what that looks like and how it kind of impacts folks when we have experienced trauma. We're going to also, and then we're going to dig into what this means to be a trauma-informed practitioner, which really is about how do we utilize that information about how trauma shows up and how it impacts folks, and use some principles that can kind of help guide us and how that can then help us figure out how we engage folks, how we serve them, and even how we maybe shape the services that we offer them. And so that's going to be a big chunk of what we talk about today, but really, a lot of it is going to be feeding into that is just how it shows up, thinking about how it impacts us so we can understand some of that. And then the general hopefully take home is you all can take pieces based on your role, based on your perspectives, what it means to be trauma informed and how can you apply that to your role in the folks that you serve, as well as each other. I always like to stress to you that these are all principles that we should be using for ourselves and for each other, meaning our coworkers and our colleagues as well, because we've all experienced trauma. We've all been impacted by things throughout our lives. And so we all deserve this same level of grace and understanding as well. So hoping we can apply that for folks. Just know what to expect in a training with us with CSH. As we said, we like to keep things engaged. I already said we're going to use polls. We're going to utilize a new tool called Mentimeter, which we'll use in a little bit. You can either use your smartphone and pull up that QR code now. Can also share the link in the chat. If you're on your computer, you can do that as well. But this is going to be an opportunity for you to just kind of engage anonymously with some of the information or questions that we have. So just want you to be prepared to do that. Get ready to do that. Also recognize that you all are working and there's a million fires going on at once. So if you're not in a space to do that, you got a call or you're literally driving to meet somebody to an appointment or escorting somebody, recognize it's going to be a little harder to engage. So we're always going to give you options to do that. And obviously, your level of engagement is completely optional, right? And voluntary. So if you don't feel comfortable engaging in that way, we totally respect that too. Just like to give folks different options, as Kate said, because we always learn something from folks. So want everyone to feel comfortable sharing and asking questions. So yes, Shelby, or I mean, not Shelby, Jamie already went through some of this, but just, again, if you can keep yourself muted, minimize that background noise, the ability you can to minimize distractions, because being present and focused is going to really help with that engagement, and just be prepared to share and learn with each other. So we're excited to do that with you all. We do like to give a little bit of a content warning, not that we're going to go into any detail about things that might be activating or triggering for folks, but just the idea of discussing trauma, how it shows up for folks, can activate things for us and ourselves. It might be things that we've directly experienced or some of the vicarious trauma that we may be experiencing in this work. And so just always want to give folks a warning so you can mentally kind of put yourself in that space to know that that might happen. We are going to do our best to avoid that. And we always encourage folks, like when Kate and I share, you'll see we try to share things very broadly and don't go into too much detail. And so going to always ask for folks to do that too. One, it kind of protects people's confidentiality, especially for sharing other folks' stories, but it also really protects it minimizes the potential of being activated, because we're not going to be sharing, explicit details or things in too much detail that might bring up images or reminders of things that we've all experienced ourselves. We may have experienced ourselves. So going to do that. And with that, knowing that that may happen, just always encourage you to take care of yourself. If you need to step away, if you need to take a breather, go off camera. We recognize Zoom fatigue is a real thing. And so if you need a break from your own managing your own facial expressions and stuff like that, always go encourage folks to do that. We'll never require you to be on camera. And then I always just tell people, I always have a fidget toy on my desk, because even when we're not talking about trauma, we get activated, right? And so having something for you to personally reconnect and center yourself, just going to encourage folks to do that in all spaces, but especially this space. So any questions so far about what to expect and how to engage with us as we go through this for the next hour and 40-ish minutes? Okay. It's also giving people a place to pause to be like, okay, we're about to start this ride. Hopefully it'll be a fun one for folks. So let's get started. And just going to start with a question for you all. And this is going to come up actually as a word cloud when we pull up the Menti, but would love for you to think about what does trauma-informed approaches, what could that look like in practice? What does that look like, feel like? And just going to encourage you to think of maybe like the first word or, phrase that comes to mind, because what you'll see when you pull up the Menti is that it actually comes into a word cloud, and it's really cool because the more overlap there is in words and phrases, the bigger the word shows up. So, you all are on top of it. We already got 19 responses. So as you'll see, compassion is coming up big for folks. Empathy, understanding, love it. Support. Again, if this link is not working for folks and you don't have the ability to pull it up, you can throw it in the chat. Thank you, Rick, for being the first one to model that. So safety in the chat and safety on the screen. I see boundaries. Holistic. I love that. Yeah, it's looking at somebody holistically, the whole picture. Nervous system. It does impact us physically. We'll talk a little bit about that and actually have a video that shows that nicely. It's about rapport building, non-judgment, active listening. Love it. Showing consideration, authentic, respect, informative. That we're listening to folks and we're thoughtful about that. Caring, kindness. This is beautiful. I'm gonna give it a couple more seconds. I see in the chat we have confidential. It is an approach, absolutely. Done with compassion. Love it, love it. Oh, I just found some. Oh, healthy food. I love that. That's the holistic part too, right? What does that look like? Taking care of ourselves completely, emotionally, and that's done through nutrition, physical work, as well as all that mental and emotional work. It's open, it's empathy. Yeah. You guys got it. This is beautiful. Okay, this is just to get us in the space, right? Like, what does this look like? Um, how might it feel? How might it look like to folks? Because, oh, didn't mean to take the word cloud off. Because, getting us in that space to think about it and really wanting to also kind of dismantle some of the, I think, preconceived notions folks have. A lot of times we hear the term trauma-informed care, and really our approach to this is it's more of an approach. It's more of a framework or a guide to how we engage folks. I think care makes people feel like it's much more of a health care or clinical thing, and anybody can do this. You don't have to have a clinical background or clinical training to engage somebody with this trauma informed lens. So thank you all for engaging with that. If you're writing something right now, don't hesitate to keep entering that. I'm just going to keep us moving along, so you can still enter some of your ideas on that too as well. So let's just get on the same page when we're talking about what is trauma. And so very simply put, trauma is basically, it's something that happens when a person is harmed by another person or people, or they experience a life-threatening event, like probably the simplest kind of definition that you can think of. What's key to distinguish this from maybe like just everyday stressors or everyday kind of incidents or smaller incidents is that this experience then can lead to a very long-lasting, or not long-lasting, a lasting effect on the people. And it really impacts your overall well-being from your physical to your emotional health. So the key here is thinking about, right, it has a lasting effect. I corrected myself with long-lasting because we don't give a timeline for that, but it's definitely going to impact you beyond the initial experience of that event. And so that's what actually trauma is. Can you all think of first things that come to mind and just throw it in the chat? What are some sources of trauma? If that's the definition of trauma, what might be some sources of trauma that we might see? Like what can we be experiencing as trauma? Or where do you see folks coming in or some common sources of their trauma? Domestic violence, assault, yep, lots of violence, family death, abuse. Oh, hey, Lupe. Yeah, we're going to talk about ACEs in a second. Car accident, homelessness. Yeah, that's what I say. We can just guarantee that almost all the folks that we serve has experienced some form of trauma just because the experience of homelessness in of itself can be very traumatic for folks. Ooh, infidelity, betrayal, loss of a loved one, verbal abuse. Yes, thank you, William. Systems. A lot of that is systematic. Just in being engaged or involved in a system is also a source of trauma for folks, like hospitalization. Thanks, Jamie. Yes, government, systematic stuff. Sex work, yep. Sickness, more ACEs. We got some ACEs experts in the room. We'll talk a little bit about that. Not too much, but a little bit in a second. All right, there's a lot, basically what you guys are saying, right? And keep them coming if you have some examples. I'm just going to share on the screen some common sources. These are not extensive, all-encompassing, because there are a lot of different ways that people experience it. Yes, like bullies, whether it's at school or in the workplace. These are all different sources of trauma. Again, the idea is to get you thinking about the various forms because there's a lot, and it's going to vary based on the folks that we engage and the people that we work with. Most of the time we think about what's in that first block on the screen, which is those large scale things, which some of you alluded to, right? Like war, major natural disasters, big things that people experience maybe at the community or household level. That is very much very true. We also have things like somebody already highlighted, things that can happen in the workplace, like harassment or bullying or drama, racism. Also, we saw domestic violence, partner abuse, interpersonal violence, that really complex chronic form of trauma people may experience for months or years. And then I think some folks talked about institutionalization. And so we always talk about justice involvement as a significant source of trauma that many of the folks that we often serve or that comes through our own systems have also experienced. So thank you all for saying that. Again, not going to go into detail, and it's an extensive list, but just wanting folks to think about it. And I will say this probably multiple times too. We may not know every single source of trauma somebody has when we're working with them. What we're going to talk a lot about today is some like kind of broad things that we know and how trauma impacts folks. It's always going to look different based on the source of trauma and the individual that's experiencing it. But the idea is to think about if we have this general knowledge, And when we start seeing some of these behaviors or seeing folks act in this way, it gives us that kind of step back to understand, okay, something happened to this individual. And so they deserve some compassion, they deserve some understanding, and maybe slightly adjust our approach to engaging them and the type of services we want to offer them, because we can understand that this may happen. We don't need to know the details or the exact source of the person's trauma to be able to do that and give them that empathy. A couple caveats too, just want to share when we think about trauma and how it impacts folks is, you do not directly have to experience trauma to have been impacted by it. And I mentioned that already. Many of us, because of the nature of this work, are going to experience some vicarious or secondary trauma. That is not unusual, and unfortunately is very common. And so again, sometimes too, unfortunately, in this day and age with social media and things being so rightly, like literally at our fingertips, sometimes it's images, sometimes it's videos that we're exposed to, that can also be very traumatic in nature based on our own backgrounds and experiences. Yeah, they do. Thank you, Paul. There's a lot of different experiences that we may have with trauma, and they impact us in different ways. We also have to really recognize too that not everyone who experiences harm or has been in a major event will be adversely impacted. We're going to talk in just a second about some protective factors that we have built in to maybe our experiences and to our lifestyle or to our upbringings that can help us maybe protect us from it having a significant adverse effect. So we have to, also recognize that. But really, the important thing is that take home message is, it's going to impact us differently, to Paul's point. It's, based on who we are, where we were literally physically positioned in the, when the event happened, our own background, our own past experiences, our social networks, what's we've built around ourselves. All of those things are going to impact, just how much it impacts us, as well as our ability to recover and heal from that trauma. And so again, we may have two people that enter our space that we're engaging with and may have very similar backgrounds and experiences, and traumatic experiences, but they're, the way it shows up and the way it's impacted them could be very, very different. And so again, really recognizing that and hopefully coming from that place of compassion can help us figure out how to best help these folks that we're trying to serve and support. So one thing we just really wanted to also highlight and recognize, because it can feel a little like doom and gloom when we start talking about all the different ways people can experience trauma and how we've all experienced it, is there are some things that also impact how it impacts folks individually. The positive side is a lot of folks do have protective factors that might be built into their lives and their experiences. One thing is that we are all working towards is a protective factor is helping people secure and maintain affordable housing. That type of security for folks really can be a protective factor. So even if the folks that we are serving that have experienced trauma before, we know that one of the things we're doing is actually going to help them recover and heal from that trauma. But if they experience any trauma after the fact, knowing that they have a safe and secure home is something that can actually put them in a position to either heal or recover quicker or lessen the impact of that trauma. So those are all the things that you're seeing on that left hand of your screen are protective factors. These are things that are going to help people. Somebody accidentally unmuted, that's fine, that are going to help people heal, either recover quicker or it's going to lessen the impact on folks. And so some of these are things that we may experienced or have seen folks experience, have seen that has been in somebody's history that might explain why some of their behaviors or the resiliency might look a little different than others. So employment, education, healthcare, great social network, family relationships, strong, healthy, supportive relationships are all going to help folks do that. And we share that too, because Kate's going to go talk about extensively about using these principles on how to support folks. But I also just like to remind folks is a lot of our services are built around just this, right? Trying to connect folks to social strong network, helping them identify healthy peer relationships. And of course, getting them into a home and maybe even gaining some type of employment or increasing their income so they can enjoy that home and a new lifestyle and thrive in their new home is going to be just as important. The risk factors are probably things that we see a lot of our folks experience, and is part of their histories. And so I think it also helps contextualize or give us kind of, some context as to why the trauma may have impacted them more significantly than others. And so really recognizing if folks have a lot of this in their background, that might really explain why they might be struggling more than others when it comes to recovery and healing, or also struggling more in their new placement and receiving the services that you're offering them, this might explain why folks are, it might look a little different for some folks than others. And so again, this is all in your learner guide that was emailed to you and that Jamie also put in the chat. So not going to go belabor this too much, but just want to give folks kind of an idea of what different, just some things. This is not everything, but just some factors that might impact the way trauma shows up for folks and their ability to heal from it. So I've done a lot of talking so far. I'm going to turn it over to you guys too for another kind of question. Can do this in the chat or in Menti, but would love to hear from you all about like how are you seeing trauma show up in the folks that you're working with? What behaviors are you seeing? You know, what kind of emotions or behaviors are you seeing that show up for folks? So you can again put it in the Mentimeter. I'll throw that in the link, or you can just do it. Ooh, Catherine, yes, hoarding. Absolutely. Anxiety, depression. Again, no wrong answers here. This is just like, what are you observing? What are you seeing? Substance abuse. Oh, Dennis, yeah, testing relationships. We're going to talk a little bit about that with an example of that very much is a sign of folks that might be a protective behavior people have learned to protect themselves, especially if past relationships have not been supportive or helpful for them. Clinginess, resistance, not willing to open up, anxiety, shame. Yeah. Oh, here we go. Scattered brain, depression, fears. Oh my gosh, you guys are great. So interactive. Yes. Anger, mistrust, closed off. So that lack of trust we're going to talk about in a little bit too. That seems to be a theme you guys are recognizing. So again, not uncommon. Self-medicating through various, right? Through either narcotics, misusing prescriptions, or misusing other substances. Anxiety, isolation. We'll talk a little bit about that too. Right. Seeing substance use. So seeing some themes here, right? Substance use or misuse, maybe some cognitive issues, not being able to focus, having their own mental illnesses or mental health declines. Oh, and just not even knowing, yeah, needing to build some skills on how to protect themselves and maybe respect boundaries. Absolutely. I'm just going to check the chat to see if we missed anything there. Yeah, again, clients not trusting. Ooh, yeah, experiences of being let down. So maybe continuing to expect that, or not trusting when they're not. Processing and recovery. Yeah, Ronald, it shows up both cognitively and behaviorally. Absolutely. Self-sabotaging. Yeah, okay. Ooh, you guys are in it. I was reading from the screen and you couldn't even see it. I'm sorry. Here's I really was reading some things that you guys were putting in the Menti. I just realized I wasn't sharing my screen properly. Okay, excellent. You guys have got it. All right, so we know how it shows up. We know a little bit of you know, how it may be impacting people. Define trauma, what that could look like. I'm just going to dig into the impact of trauma, and in a second, I'm going to share a video with you all that I think does a great job of articulating and just visually as well as verbally demonstrating just what that can look like and how it literally does impact our brain, and then of course the rest of our body and our behaviors. So I'm going to share that and stop talking in just a second. I have to share this in a new way than I normally do, so I'm just going to make sure volume and all things are set up. Okay, so I'm going to share this for 4 minutes, or yeah, it's a little over 4 minutes, but it's a good video, so hopefully you guys can enjoy it. You guys hear that okay? Can tell me if
Are you sleeping restlessly, feeling irritable or moody, forgetting little things, and feeling overwhelmed and isolated? Don't worry, we've all been there. You're probably just stressed out. Stress isn't always a bad thing. It can be handy for a burst of extra energy and focus, like when you're playing a competitive sport or have to speak in public. But when it's continuous, the kind most of us face day in and day out, it actually begins to change your brain. Chronic stress, like being overworked or having arguments at home, can affect brain size, its structure, and how it functions, right down to the level of your genes. Stress begins with something called the hypothalamus-pituitary-adrenal axis, a series of interactions between endocrine glands in the brain and on the kidney, which controls your body's reaction to stress. When your brain detects a stressful situation, Your HPA axis is instantly activated and releases a hormone called cortisol, which primes your body for instant action. But high levels of cortisol over long periods of time wreak havoc on your brain. For example, chronic stress increases the activity level and number of neural connections in the amygdala, your brain's fear center. And as levels of cortisol rise, electric signals in your hippocampus, the part of the brain associated with learning, memories, and stress control, deteriorate. The hippocampus also inhibits the activity of the HPA axis, so when it weakens, so does your ability to control your stress. That's not all, though. Cortisol can literally cause your brain to shrink in size. Too much of it results in the loss of synaptic connections between neurons and the shrinking of your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that regulates behaviors like concentration, decision-making, judgment, and social interaction. It also leads to fewer new brain cells being made in the hippocampus. This means chronic stress might make it harder for you to learn and remember things, and also set the stage for more serious mental problems like depression and eventually Alzheimer's disease. The effects of stress may filter right down to your brain's DNA. An experiment showed that the amount of nurturing a mother rat provides its newborn baby plays a part in determining how that baby responds to stress later in life. The pups of nurturing moms turned out less sensitive to stress because their brains developed more cortisol receptors, which stick to cortisol and dampen the stress response. The pups of negligent moms had the opposite outcome, and so became more sensitive to stress throughout life. These are considered epigenetic changes, meaning that they affect which genes are expressed without directly changing the genetic code. And these changes can be reversed if the moms are swapped. But there's a surprising result. The epigenetic changes caused by one single mother rat were passed down to many generations of rats after her. In other words, the results of these actions were inheritable. It's not all bad news, though. There are many ways to reverse what cortisol does to your stressed brain. The most powerful weapons are exercise and meditation, which involves breathing deeply and being aware and focused on your surroundings. Both of these activities decrease your stress and increase the size of the hippocampus, thereby improving your memory. So don't feel defeated by the pressures of daily life. Get in control of your stress before it takes control of you.
Okay, thoughts, initial reactions to that. I saw someone had a question. I'm sorry I didn't see when the question came in about, did he say brain and kidneys? But it looks like somebody caught that. And yes, Joe, I can share the link for that in just a second. It should be in the learner guide, but just to be safe, I can share the link. Any other thoughts or? I know, Jane. Okay, so I'm going to give a little caveat about that because I always worry about that too, because it does feel, I mean, they try to end with a little positive note, right? There are some things to do. And literally the second half of this, I think, is going to talk a lot about not just how we can help other folks heal and build resiliency from stress or just trauma, but also how we can do that for ourselves. Meditation they talked about. So one thing I like about this this video is it does, and here's the link for folks that wanted it, is the is what it really focuses on too, is that as much as it does show that there is a direct impact on and that they use chronic stress, and we use this because what they're saying about chronic stress is very similar and very true for what happens with trauma. We do want to say when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about, you know, things, chronic stress and beyond, that are even more significant to folks, but they have the same kind of impact on our brains and the rest of our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. But the idea really is, you know, that recognizing as much as it can have an impact, once we know how that it does impact us, we also know how we can counter that and heal a lot. And a big piece of that is breathing. Folks may have noticed everyone's focusing more on that, but there's a lot of data and research that shows our ability to kind of manage our breathing. The physiological impact it has on us is kind of helping reset our brain and counter all those negative things that can happen when we are stressed or activated by past trauma. And so all the things you're seeing about apps coming out to teach folks on how to breathe, all the box breathing exercises you might see folks engage more in, there's a reason behind that. Meditation is a great tool because it does help do that, and it really focuses on that, as well as other things where you're kind of reteaching your brain to think about things. But exercise too, we know, is also something that can combat and help with some of that cortisol, overproduction of cortisol. Yeah, it is a really great coping skill. And I help use it personally. I use it on my kids. And when I was working directly with folks, we used it as well. People don't like it at first, and they may be like thinking it's weird. But it does help if you just give it a chance, focusing on that. I use it all the time. It helps me all the time. Any other reactions or questions that I heard? I don't see anything. So again, it's a great way just to see how it can impact folks. What we're going to do is, that was a lot of science behind it. Just going to talk a little bit more about some of that, how the impact of it, can impact us, what we do know based on some research. And some of you already mentioned this, so I'm glad folks are very aware of this. So if you saw ACEs in the chat and you haven't heard what that is, it stands for oh my gosh, can I talk today? Adverse childhood experiences. My brain is doing this thing where it's merging two words on its own. And so this really refers to a study that was done several years ago that really looked at, if folks, they kind of narrowed it down to kind of 10 questions, basically, they ask you. They all get at some of those broader experiences that a lot of folks may experience in their childhood around abuse, neglect, maybe if a caregiver was struggling themselves, and even a violence in the household. They ask questions around that. And basically, based on your score, how many of those experiences you've had, it was able to predict some like outcomes later in life for folks. Missed what you said I used. I'm talking about breathing exercises, box breathing. We can share some links too on that, but a lot of apps kind of talk and use that. But what we learned about the ACEs, what we learned from ACEs is kind of what that video was showing, and what a lot of us probably already knew through our own experiences, is that having some of those childhood experiences does have a direct impact on how we, on our overall well-being later on in life. And so what this study did is kind of really make it a very tangible, clear outcomes in terms of what those connections were. I do like to always give the caveat to say that, it came out of the healthcare system. And so a lot of it was focused on some, people are more likely to have chronic health conditions. They're more likely to experience substance use or mental illness. But what we really just want to make sure we always give the caveat is, just because someone has a high score in the ACEs, and if you take the ACEs score yourself, I've taken the ACEs test myself, we may have experienced those things. It doesn't mean we're destined to have these negative impacts or negative outcomes in our life. I think the idea is knowing that if it increases our likelihood, then hopefully it remotivates us or helps us really focus on all the ways that we can prevent it. Everybody froze on my screen. Okay, just making sure it wasn't my internet. So the idea is, knowing these things, again, helps us kind of put us in a better position to understand, why things may be showing up differently for some folks, but also how can we counter those measures, or maybe add those protective measures, or add some of the approaches that Kate's going to talk a little bit about being trauma informed. Yeah, I'm sorry if I'm cutting in and out. I could tell by people's videos freezing that my internet might be a little wonky. So I'm going to try to do that. I'll probably just go off video is one way to help, but I'll also talk a little slower in case that helps. But please signal to me if it's not, if it's still a little choppy. I apologize. So we share that just so folks understand that background. Again, there's links to if you want to dig more into ACEs, and it sounds like some of you already know that. But the idea is just to understand that a lot of us experience trauma early on in life, and it's going to have a long-lasting impact. And the adage that time heals all wounds is not necessarily the case, as the video said. It's not just, over time we can get over it. That happened to you 30 years ago. You should be over it by now. It does have a significant impact. And so that's why, again, coming through a trauma-informed approach is just even more necessary, I think, and heightens the need for it, is because what we do know is that you need to actively work on your healing, and people need to actively be supported on working on their healing to counter some of these negative impacts that it has on folks. Because we do know that if you've had these adverse childhood experiences, and I like this kind of tree because it kind of gives you a visual of that, if those are our roots, right, it's going to impact how we then grow. And what we need to know is once we're above ground and we've got these roots and we've got these flowers developing, we got to water ourselves and others with some of those counter things, some of the things that Kate will talk about, some of those protective factors that we know, so we can grow and counter any of the negative impacts that might be causing some challenges based on our roots and based on our past experiences. So let me kind of make this come together through an example. We're going to introduce a case study that we can kind of all work through, and we're going to talk about we're going to introduce you to a person named Jay. So Jay is a fictional character, but let's just talk through how the impact of trauma might show up by using Jay, like a specific person, get out of kind of the theoretical research side of it and really think about it practically. And so I'm just going to, even though there's no typical way it shows up, hopefully using Jay and a practical example can kind of help us understand what this looks like. And based on some of Jay's experiences, you may, be working with somebody who is very similar to Jay. Just based on some of what you guys have shared already, I think you might be able to relate. So Jay has experienced homelessness for several years. He was also incarcerated for over 3 years, and he also struggles with using meth or misusing meth. And so his experience of trauma began in his childhood. Thinking about ACEs, he experienced some neglect and abuse, unfortunately, from his parents, and even had a brief, and even was in foster care for a brief period of time. And so one thing to know about somebody like Jay, when they experience these types of harm and this types of trauma, especially in their childhood, it's imprinted into their brain, right? Like we just learned in that video. And so what happens is we often get stuck in survival mode. And so if somebody wants to remember the harm, and it's a protective factor because we want to remember that harm and what those sources of harm were, because we want to be able to prevent future harm. And so this might be why, it looks like, his brain is going to be on high alert. He's going to be actively looking for harm because he's experienced so much of it. He is going to be actively looking for it so he can avoid it or protect himself from it. So what does this look like in kind of behavior, or how like you might see Jay acting? Well, he may be hypervigilant, right? And doesn't trust people easily. A lot of you brought that up in terms of how it shows up. For Jay, other people, specifically people in a parental authority figure, have been sources of harm in his life. So it makes sense that he might be protective and might be hypervigilant and paranoid or worried that other people and other experiences are also going to cause harm for him. So, if you've experienced what Jay's experienced, it might be practical to like not be trusting, right? If many adults in your life, or maybe every adult in your life up to this point, has been harmful to you, has been abusive, or not cared about your needs, it's very much, I think, a realistic or a common, or normal, quote unquote normal, reaction to want to protect yourself from that. One thing, just to the word normal, I like to reiterate a saying that a colleague taught us, which is like any reaction to an abnormal experience is a normal reaction. So I don't like to use the word normal because people have ideas of what normal is, but any reaction that Jay has to his experiences is going to be normal and I think expected for him. So, this is how he may feel, right? He's not going to trust folks. He may constantly be on high alert, expecting other people to harm him. Right. And it's going to have a big impact on his life moving forward. Thanks, folks. And thank you, Jacques, for sharing the Breath by James Nestor. Good resource. See, we always have something to learn from each other. And absolutely, Irma, it's going to impact him, right? And so also thinking about for Jay, what we also know about how trauma impacts folks is it really makes it hard for people to learn from experience, to learn new things. And so for Jay's case, his experience is very much going to shape the way he sees the world. Again, people may equal harm to him. And so he's not going to trust folks. He's not going to want to engage folks. So he may look like that in a lot of situations, right? Like off-putting. He might feel like he's protecting himself. He may have body language that shows he is not engaged and doesn't want to engage, or may appear standoffish or defensive to folks. And so it's important for us, if we're going to use this trauma-informed lens, to recognize that it's more about what happened to Jay that's probably impacting his behavior towards us. and not come from a place of like, what's wrong with him, right? But more curious and hopefully compassionate to be like, what's happened to him that's made him act this way, and how can I prove to him that this is a different space, I am a different person that can be trusted and can be supportive of him. What also may come up that some of you brought up too is, another protective thing that folks may learn or develop over time, having experienced some of the trauma like Jay has experienced, which is, some of what we know Jay experiences, you can imagine much of his life was in a space of fear, continual fear, right? Of something, another bad thing happening or another abusive incident happening to him. And so again, if you've lived your life like this a lot, it may be harder for you to understand or be able to even appraise when a space is safe, because we've constantly been in a space of fear. And so it may take a while for him to, want to engage with folks. And so oftentimes what people realize is like, it's easier to isolate or be by myself than it is to be out in a world where I might be exposed to more abuse. Many of you brought up substance use or misuse, or self-medicating, as folks say. And so that might be why he turned to meth use, right? Is this might be a way that Jay's learned to maybe isolate himself or numb himself from what he's experienced. And so again, this is also something that is not uncommon that we see in folks who've had similar experiences as Jay. Right, Autumn, that's a really good point, and I think important for us to recognize too, especially in the work we're doing. We might often be the first person that's giving somebody good news or giving somebody, what feels like a great opportunity. But it's not, uncommon for them to also not trust it, right? Because it might be that they may have been offered similar promises before, right? Or because we represent a system that's let them down before, I don't think it's unrealistic for them to not trust us the first time. So I think that's really important for us to recognize, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I've had tenants or clients say too, like, okay, so when is this good thing going to end, right? Or how long is this going to last? Because they've, unfortunately, that's what their life has taught them, that it doesn't always last, or it's not to be trusted. It's also important to recognize too that, when you've had continuous, yes, when's the other shoe going to drop? Or they've had continuous shoes drop, or they've had continuous letdowns in their life, especially like someone like Jay, thinking about the systems he's gone through, and how much power he's probably not had in those systems. It can be easy for one to start thinking like, this is how my life is, right? This is how I'm destined to live my life. Maybe I deserve some of that abuse, or maybe, I should just give up because clearly I don't have control of my life or what's going on. And so it's very easy for folks to kind of feel this endless sense of hopelessness, powerlessness. And again, we might be the first person that's trying to empower them in a different way or show them that they're empowered. And so, again, if they're not quick to jump on it or are distrusting of it or disbelieving of it, it's important for us to recognize that is a very common reaction to folks who have experienced a lot of trauma. Along with the fact that, if they've always felt like they were to blame or they've been told that they were to blame for some of these experiences, a lot of that shame and guilt is going to be seeped in. Again, with someone like Jay, who's now using meth, there's a lot of stigma around substance use and misuse. There's a lot of stigma with someone who's been incarcerated like he's experienced. And so he may feel a lot of shame and guilt about that, which again can look like distrust, can look like someone being standoffish, but it's really just how people are processing their own experiences. And if they haven't had a way to process that and heal it and been shown that what they're experiencing and what they're feeling is not uncommon and directly connected to something that happened to them, not because of who they are, but happened to them because of their experiences, these feelings are going to very much impact the way they interact with folks and the way they show up. And just going to give a caveat here that all of this is going to look different based on Jay's ethnic, racial, religious background, right? All of these things that make us unique individuals, and really cool, unique individuals, I should say, is also going to impact the way maybe some of this shows up. It may make stigma or guilt even more pronounced in some folks, or maybe less pronounced. And so that's always going to be important to recognize that. And Kate's going to talk a little bit about cultural humility, but that's why it's a key part of being trauma informed, is recognizing those individual differences in folks. Yeah, Ronald, that's a good way of putting it too. Yeah, Murphy's Law mindset. Like Murphy's Law is always going to impact me, right? Because that's what life has showed me so far. Why shouldn't I continue to believe it? One thing we often get to, and one thing that's really important if we think about implementing this trauma-informed approach to our work, is our big goal is really going to be how do we avoid the potential of somebody being re-traumatized. So a lot of questions we get in these trainings too is like, how can we help people when they are reminded of the past and it's activated, or what some people use as the word triggers. You'll notice that I try not to use that word because that word in of itself can sometimes be an activation or activating word for folks. So we haven't found the perfect replacement. So, but anything that kind of activates and reminds somebody of the past is something that's uncontrollable and can really bring somebody into a space that they're not aware of. And so this can come through basically all the different senses. It can be a sound, it can be a taste, a smell, a touch, or even a sight. So, you may look like somebody from their past. Your office may have a similar color scheme to the like places in the past that they've had negative experiences. These are all things that we just kind of have to be aware of. What's really important to know is that the person who's experienced that may not be aware of it themselves. It may be hard for somebody to connect the smell of gasoline to a specific trauma that they've had in their past. But what we can do as people that are working with them and observing them is note that every time somebody enters this space, their behavior changes or they seem to be upset. And so just we don't need to know the details, but just recognize maybe we should meet with them in a different space because it's either the smell, the sound, the lighting, something is having a negative impact on that person. And so we might want to offer that. Some folks have done a lot of work, and so they may know. I've had clients that tell me like, I can't meet with you here, or I don't want to meet in a space with no windows, whatever. They're very clear about that. So again, approaching with curiosity and asking questions can help, but a lot of it is just making those observations and just being aware that these are the things that can impact people. I will say from my experience and knowing from what research tells us, smell is actually the strongest sense that we have that's connected to memories. So being very aware of how things smell, speaking to a person who has chronic allergies and usually can't smell, is hard for me. But I think it's important is just, asking folks those questions too, because we often aren't aware of that, but oftentimes it's just as simple as like getting a whiff of cinnamon or something that can bring us back somewhere that we don't even recognize. And so it does, and also, we know that trauma impacts memory, so we may not be able to remember. A lot of folks have had significant trauma that they don't have clear memories of. So they may be having that smell or that taste that's reminding them, but they just know it creates a negative sensation or negative emotion for them, but they may not be able to explicitly tell you. But again, we don't need to know all the details to still offer that type of support and compassion that somebody may need in that moment and then moving forward. And then last but not least, just, when folks are activated and you are noticing these things, or they are expressing to you that something may be a trigger or an activation for them, the biggest things that we can do is just one, be sensitive and compassionate to it, right? And recognizing that, again, it shows up for everybody differently. And also just really, do what we can to help them avoid that next time, so maybe you meet them in different spaces. Maybe you find a different doctor's office that they can attend, or a different route to the doctor's office if there's things that are activating them. But the biggest thing I think is to also give ourselves some compassion, because we can't erase all things. We can't, protect people completely 100%. We can just do what we can to actively reduce the likelihood of them being, triggered and activated. And once we do know what a trigger activation is, we can absolutely, go into full protective mode and figure out how to help them avoid that in the future. But we can't completely protect them and control all environments that they enter in, which is why having this trauma-informed approach can help them build some of that resiliency if it does happen again, which Kate is going to go to in a second. But before that, any questions of anything we've come up with so far? We've talked about the impact of trauma. Pause.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, I do have a question.
Yeah.
What kind of signage do you recommend in office spaces or like community dwellings that can be indicators of the sensitivities around trauma, kind of to try to ensure that this is a safe place? Are there any things that you could recommend that people could begin to see visually?
That's a great question. I don't know if Kate, anything comes to mind for you. I think so first I'll just plug something, but it's a total cheap plug because we have a free training that talks about what you're talking about too, is trauma-informed design. And there is a whole thing there that talks into like how do you create spaces physically that feel more welcoming. I don't know if there's like a specific sign or language that I can say other than language that feels open and welcoming, but I think a lot of it is just thinking about the space in general. Do you have natural light? Is there a lot of open space? It's not too cluttered so people feel like they can walk through easily and exit easily too if they feel like they're in danger. And I that's why it's not my area of expertise when it comes to trauma informed design, but there's like learning about color palettes and stuff like that can be helpful. And even just having like plants. I don't know if you guys know that, but there's this whole like biophilia. I'm not gonna say the word thing, but there's something about us being connected to nature that also can be nice and soothing. So having things like that. I don't know if that's answering your question, Michelle, or Kate, if you have anything you want to add. No pressure.
No, no, not at all.
Oh,
I would agree
humidifiers. Yeah.
with I would agree with what you said, and I also appreciate the question. I think it's just so much about setting up a comfortable environment. And one thing I'm thinking about too is I don't know if this is necessarily something to post on the wall, though it might be helpful to have it visible somewhere small. But just letting folks know whenever they do any kind of intake or things like that, like, hey, if something comes up, like who can I talk to? Who is it that I can go to? Just knowing that they have options in case something is uncomfortable or in case something is they would like to have addressed that they may or may not want to address, with you directly, or just to know they can address it with you directly, just being clear in those sorts of ways. One thing I would caution against, and I don't think this was part of your question or statement, but just we're going to talk about safe space, brave space a little bit later, but just never declaring a space a safe space, because that's it's different to everyone. It can sometimes take time and sometimes might not be a thing that we can achieve, but helping to make it hopefully as safe as possible, um, yeah, is key.
Yeah. I will say one of the key principles around trauma informed design too that they say that you just made me think of too, Kate, is that they say ask folks and get people's input first on what they want things to look like. So that might also be something you may want to just engage current clients or tenants that you're working with or future ones and say, ask them like what kind of, like if you're thinking signage, either like that's directional, like this is where you go, or about who we are, I would get their input on how to like write that out and what that might look like. But if you're also thinking of like motivational quotes or something like that, I would also just get their input as well. I do want to, and I want to say that to you to address, I think, some of the questions that came up too about essential oils, and somebody said allergies. No way. Again, I would ask folks too, because essential oils are nice. They smell great. I'm an essential oil diffuser person. I love the way they smell. And there might be certain scents that are also activating for folks, or as somebody put, maybe it's, initiate some reaction. So again, you just want to ask folks. I think that and transparency is key. So if you're also thinking about signage that can help people know what to expect, we also always encourage that as well. This is where we are, this is who we are, anything like that can be helpful for folks.
I have just a real super quick follow-up question to that. Is there any links that you could possibly share on the trauma-informed design? I think that would be really helpful for me and the work that I do in terms of site monitoring programs. And then I love the idea of bringing the participants along. Of course, that makes absolute sense. But then also nonprofits have their limit in terms of the budget and what they could do. But just speaking to the space, the gender responsiveness things, and different types of environment that might speak to one group of folks and different for another. But I would love that if you were able to share at some point. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll put it in just a second as soon as I'm not sharing my screen in full transparency. So you don't have to see all the tabs, and I won't be judged for all the tabs I have up on my thing, but I'll share that. Yeah, because it is free. And I will say to your point too about nonprofits having limited budgets is they talk a little bit about small things you can do, like put a plant in there. But then they talk about also like building new things, but also rehabbing some things. But they give a great, and there's a link in there to a whole other organization that we've worked with a lot that's advised us a lot about trauma-informed design principles. So absolutely. And they specifically work in supportive housing and homeless systems. So they talk about working with shelters and other housing facilities. So Absolutely. Okay, I'm gonna give us a little break. So folks have time to stretch, answer that email or call that's been like ringing in your ear. So I'm gonna like average it out because also I don't like to do hard math. If folks can return at 10 after 11, so it's about an 8-minute break. We're aiming for 10, but probably me talk too long. So if people can get back at 11:10, we will restart. I want to give folks a chance to break, stretch, get some water, snack. It's almost lunchtime.
Okay, all, you have another minute or so. Just wanted to give a audio heads up in case you're a person who likes to be back as soon as we start. We'll get started in about a minute or so. If you need a little more time, that's also okay. Okay, well, it's about 10 after, according at least to my clock. If we want to head back in, I'm going to get started here, slowly get started as we kind of come back from break. Just want to appreciate everyone and honor everyone for all that they shared earlier this morning. Well, earlier this morning, just a moment ago. And just really, really loved the engagement and all the questions and all the great resources that were shared and are currently being shared in chat. Just thank you all so much for that. It's great. I love learning from you all. This is great. As we get started, now that Ari has shared an overview of the influencing factors and impact of trauma, a bit of how that can play out, for the next part of our time together, we really want to dig into the trauma-informed approaches portion of this. Many of you have likely heard this referred to as trauma-informed care instead of trauma-informed approaches. If that's something that's true for you, if that language is something that's more familiar, don't worry, you're still in the right place. We're talking about the same things. And in the Learner Action Guide, we'll be linking to some information that SAMHSA, or the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, outlines around the 6 principles of trauma-informed care, which we'll use and go over in just a moment. But the reason that we at CSH talk about trauma-informed approaches versus care is that really, at the end of the day, we're talking about an overall approach. Oftentimes, the word care is really associated with something more clinical, or something that only those with service provider in their title can perform, or things of that nature. Whereas in reality, being trauma-informed really is for everyone. I use it in my work life as well as my personal life. I had a colleague somewhat recently talk about how really her dream is for people to just kind of operate from that lens altogether, no matter the circumstance, and to not feel as though they have to turn it on or turn it off when they arrive or leave at work. And truthfully, her hope was that they don't even have to think about it because it's just kind of a way of being. I believe she even called it a lifestyle, which I think is fantastic. So. With that, let's get into it. Wanted to dig in a bit. We're going to have a mentee in just a moment. And that's going to help us kind of get into like the practical application of this as we kind of get started with our journey of the 6 principles. So wanted to ground ourselves into an example to help again kind of shift away from the experience of trauma that you all were talking about earlier, and over to how you might work with someone in a trauma-informed way. I know for me, again, I have sometimes the easiest time doing this if I can picture something that relates to me. So let's go with what's likely an experience that each of us has had at one point or another. Going to a doctor for the first time. So let's say, you set up an appointment, you're heading to the office or workspace, and now it's time to go in. You're ready. What are things that would make you feel comfortable? And we'll pull up a mentee in just a moment. And you can share in chat as well if you'd prefer. Great. I see some responses coming in chat. We'll see the mentee in just a moment. Familiar with your history? Yeah, they've done a little bit of research before they get there. Totally. Yep. It's not a clinical setting. Yep. See some friendly staff, calm colors. Yep, we've talked a lot about that this morning. I love it. Clean space, smiles, compassionate. Yep, comfy chairs, approachability. Yes. Might be concerned that they won't understand you. Yep, so there's some concerns coming in. Yep. Welcoming staff, not feeling rushed, engaging. Yep, that they're on time. Exactly. On time means they respect my time. Things can happen, but at the doctor, gosh, I don't know about you all, but there's been occasions that I've had to wait 2 hours and it just doesn't make me feel good or valued. Yep. Open-minded, yep, being listened to. Yep. Clean. Friendly, again, not being rushed. Friendly staff. So one thing about Menti is that the bigger the words, it means more than one person has put the response in. So see lots of stuff around friendly staff, approachable, approachability, those pieces. Yep, cultural knowledge. Yep, absolutely. Being listened to, being welcomed, offer some type of olive branch. Yep, not being rushed. I'm seeing a lot of that. I'm just catching up with chat over here. Soft voices, personable, that nonverbal connection. Oh my goodness, that is so important. Yes, we read so much and hear and understand so much, not through like actual physical hearing, but just through people's body language. Yep. Going with a friend might be helpful. Yep, reduce wait time, empathetic approach. Oh, answering questions and addressing concerns, not use casual language of not being blown off is how I kind of think about that one, that people are actually listening and engaged in what I'm saying. Yep. Offer translation. Yeah. If there's any sort of language barrier, want to be extra clear depending upon the situation. Yep, for sure. That's offered up front, no questions asked, and just there. No worries about all caps. You're welcome to put all caps, however you'd like to respond. Yep, simple language too. Yeah, we're not all doctors. I was talking with a doctor friend yesterday and I said, I'm sorry, I have no idea what you're saying because they were getting into really technical, detailed things. Yep, yep, not being rushed. Gosh, these are such great examples. I'm seeing, yep, that they know your name as well. Again, you're not just a number, they know your name, you feel valued, they've done their homework, all these sorts of things. Oh, these are such great example. I know for me too, a couple big ones for me is I really appreciate a sense of humor. And then also making me feel like I'm not an inconvenience, which I think all the different things that you all described, kind of the detail in there really kind of um, elevates that. Yeah, so I'm appreciating that. I'm seeing in chat as well that they use a translator app with a Spanish speaking client, told another coworker how much it meant to her that you did that. Yep, absolutely. It's important, right? Like the language we speak, the words we use, all those things is critical and it's a part of who we are. And it's important to honor and value that. That's a great example. Yep, expertise in their field as well. If I'm going in for a foot issue, I would rather not see a psychiatrist. Great. All right. Well, thank you all so much for sharing those. You are welcome, of course, to keep sharing in chat. Um, Let me talk a little bit here about what does it mean to be trauma informed. So the definition that you see on your screen is one of many different definitions of trauma informed care, which is from, as before mentioned, SAMHSA. So trauma informed care is the adoption of principles and practices that promote a culture of safety, empowerment, and healing. So as I think back to what all of you shared just a moment ago, to me this definition really kind of sums everything that you all said up in just a very simple sentence right there. So with that, how do we know if something is trauma informed? So SAMHSA has some language for that as well. And with that, SAMHSA's concept of a trauma-informed approach, according to that, a program, an organization, or a system that is trauma-informed does a few things. One, it realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery. It recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, others involved with the system. It responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. So trauma-informed care often is described as that shift in thinking that moves from asking or thinking kind of what's wrong with you over to what happened to you. And even more recently, I've heard it described, which I really like, as what's happening in your body as a response to trauma, as we really feel these things in our bodies. And our body remembers, how many times have you had a physical reaction to something, but not understood what's happening or why? It may be that that's a trauma response happening. That happened to me not super long ago. I was in the midst of a training very similar to this. Something came up. I think an example was shared. And I suddenly started fumbling for words. I was starting to sweat. I could feel my pulse increase. And it took me a good 10 minutes once my section was done to figure out what was it? What just happened? Like, what is going on? And my body knew before my rational brain could catch up. A couple great books on this. I see that one has already been shared. I find this one to be really fantastic. It's by Resma Menachem, gentleman out of Minneapolis. His book, it's called On My Grandmother's Hands. His book in particular talks a lot about racialized trauma and somatic abolitionism. And another one is The Body Keeps the Score by Besser van der Kolk. So two great books. There are many out there, but those are just a couple quick ones that I think are fairly straightforward reads. All these things to say too as we think about this, right? Everybody's story is different. As you all have illustrated in the chat, right? We each experience things differently and bring our background and experiences we've had to every situation, and each of us is different and has been through different things. And a lot of the folks that we work with, whether it's a client, a colleague, a staff, a supervisor, we might never know the full extent of the sorts of trauma that they've experienced in the past. So really by approaching each person with curiosity as well as grace, it can help to kind of shift the interactions that you have. And same thing with how you approach and treat yourself, because I really think we can often be hardest on ourselves. At least I know I certainly can be. So again, six principles, what are they according to SAMHSA? We're going to walk through them one by one. And as we do, I'd love to note again, I see there's lots of great questions and examples coming through in chat. This course is only an introduction to these principles. We really recommend that you explore each of these areas further to really understand how to apply these in practice. And as I already mentioned earlier, how you're likely already practicing some of these, perhaps without having words for it or knowing that like, hey, I'm doing a thing, right? This is trauma-informed approaches. Let me just check chat real quick. One person is sharing, yep, we're encouraged to go through body keep score independently instead of with someone else might cause anxiety and overwhelm. Yeah, I appreciate that example. I like being able to kind of sit with something. Sometimes it can take me a little bit to process, and I'm an external processor. I like to process with others, but it also takes a little bit for things to kind of like sink in and help me work through it. So I love that suggestion that you were given, and I'm glad it worked for you. Other great book examples coming through from folks in the chat if you want to check that out and haven't already. So first principle of 6 is safety. And so with this one, it's not only physical safety, but also emotional and psychological safety. Again, thinking back to Jay's story that Ari mentioned earlier, what might help Jay to feel safe and in all the different ways that safety can come into play. When it comes to the work that each of you do here today, each of you that are here today do, housing is a really, really clear example of providing safety. So, 4 walls are not the be all end all, of course, but they are huge when it comes to safety and security and all types of safety and security. Being able to lock a person's door, have a private space, choose who you invite into that space is a really, really big deal. And when it comes to supportive housing, the services component of that is critical as well. Another one, emotional safety. I don't know about you, but this has happened to me. I feel like there's always at least one person that kind of fit this category, that one person who always seems to yell at you and only you. I've again had those relationships in the past, and while it might not feel like it in the moment, you may be the one person that individual knows that they're able to feel safe to express themselves around. When we think about release, it's a really powerful thing. It's a really necessary thing. And so are boundaries, of course. It's not okay to have someone yell at you all the time, but it's good to keep trauma in mind as something that might be factoring into what's going on, as what might be behind some of that yelling and that way of expressing. And then be able to, when that happens, work with a person when they're a little less activated to be able to talk about outlets through which they can find release that don't involve yelling at you. I'm a person who's very activated by yelling, so this was always a tough one for me to kind of sit with and address. But once I learned that particular piece of information, it helps. It helped quite a bit. Um, so as we think about this, wanted to talk a bit as we think about safety. Wanted to dig into the mention of kind of racialized and intersectional safety that was mentioned just a moment ago. Racialized trauma is a form of trauma that's experienced by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and is defined as a complex trauma resulting from the ongoing experience of oppression and subordination, mental and emotional injury caused by encounters with racial bias and ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. So when it comes to trauma, there's acute, complex, and chronic forms of trauma. And racialized trauma is most like chronic in that BIPOC folks are subject to it throughout their lives. The way that racialized trauma shows up might be obvious, might be more subtle or insidious. So we wanted to share a 2-minute video with you all about microaggressions. Microaggressions are often subtle, very insidious, and a big part why we all need to have kind of cultural awareness. And they can often happen without a person intending to cause harm, but are really a result oftentimes of unconscious bias that a person holds. And when this happens, the person who's experiencing the microaggression or being discriminated against is often left suffering in silence or feeling uncomfortable. So, excuse me, I'm going to play this video. It's about 3 minutes long. Do want to give just a quick heads up that this video, we like to share it because it's It does a great job, Ari and I feel, of like getting out a information on a difficult subject with a little bit of humor in there, but it's also, of course, due to the nature of the subject, quite serious. So a few folks have shared in the past that it kind of can be a little bit activating for them. So just wanted to give a heads up on that before I share it. So, okay, I'm going to hit play.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
Oh, you're so well spoken.
just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while,
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date,
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
going grocery shopping,
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
commuting to work,
So when are you gonna have a baby?
watching TV,
We have to keep the Redskins' name. It's part of our culture and history.
or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? Give me shopping advice. I love Cher too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every day,
Can I touch your hair?
multiple times a day,
So pretty. Can
Can I touch
your
it,
hair,
please? Can I please?
is annoying. And makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes, which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares? Just another angry black woman.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try this challenging major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
He looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
All right. I'm going to pause in case anyone has any. What do folks think? Any reactions? Any responses? Again, no mandatory sharing, anything like that through any of this training, but just any initial responses or things that made you think about or things you might want to share or curious what resonated. Paper cuts. Yes. Oh my gosh. That's a great descriptor. Yes, I wish there was a spray. I agree, Dennis. Yes, if there was only a spray for microaggressions. Yep. Shayna goes, I think about that paper cuts example. It makes me think too about how like we've got paper cuts, and then I don't know if anybody's ever had a cardboard cut where like oh, like there's so many different levels of how that can be so painful and how it just can just escalate and escalate and escalate. Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate the video on so many different levels, you know, and I think, yeah, drawing blood, it does. It takes the piece of your piece, a part of your piece or dignity. That's a great way to put it. Um, you know, again, as we think about microaggressions as they relate to safety, as well as culture, history, gender principles, all these different things, all of this is really, really critical as we think about the impact of harm and trauma. And yes, I agree, Diana. They throw a little bit of humor in there as well. And yeah, the small cuts absolutely, Marvel, hurt the worst. Um, you know, the effect of microaggressions is not micro, it's really macro. And some of the effects of these sorts of slights, and especially as they again accumulate over time, are very serious. You know, anxiety, depression, trouble sleeping, intrusive thoughts, and questioning of whether a person is overreacting. You know, loss of drive. You know, so many different things. You know, how many times do people actually say something when they experience a microaggression? You know, when is it just too much to take on, and how does fear of making it worse play into this as one considers whether or not to address something or if they're safe to say something at all. So think about this in terms of staff, in terms of supervisors, just the work that we all do, and just frankly how we kind of walk through life. You know, how are we, you know, creating safety? How are we perhaps contributing to harm? You know, if you witness or commit a microaggression and then ignore it because you're uncomfortable, that's contributing to the problem as well. You know, it's really tricky. It's tough stuff, and it takes practice as well. Yes, nonchalantness of the oppressor. Yep, absolutely. And yes, thanks again for all these great examples. Hopefully, folks are watching chat because it's not just the initial pain, but how raw the space is after. Yeah, it's not a one and done by any sense. So appreciate folks sharing these and sharing some examples. So we mentioned, safe space, brave space earlier. Kind of made mention of that. Wanted to share this again, go into it just a little bit more. To add some nuance to the safety principle. As we think about, are we creating safe places, or excuse me, safe spaces? Are we creating brave spaces? What's the difference? So it's not. You can see some definition or a little bit of one up on the screen. It's not that one is necessarily good and the other is bad, but really wanted to talk through about how they are different. Again, for me, I know I often can't get to safe space right away, and sometimes ever, because trust and psychological safety really needs to be in place for safe space to exist, at least for me. And that doesn't happen overnight. It's a really relational thing. I know for me, it's a major pet peeve of mine when I walk into a room or a meeting and somebody that I usually have never met before declares it a safe space. I could go, really, for whom? What is it about that person that makes it safe for me to be there? And conversely, if somebody says that when I'm in a room, why do they automatically think that I must be safe to be around? A while ago, I had an upper level exec ask me, how long it might take for their organization to kind of make it to safe space collectively across the board with each other. And my answer, which I think they were surprised at, was, probably never, honestly. So, a lot of people might have that, and hopefully, I suspect do have that individually, one-on-ones or in smaller groups. But I really think it's hard, if not impossible, to achieve that completely with like 180 plus people that happen to be the size of this organization. And that's okay. That's why, again, why we have trauma-informed approaches with each other, how we work together, all those sorts of things. And with brave space, acknowledging, we can use this to acknowledge that safety isn't guaranteed in a space, but we're making that a commitment to really own our impact, be thoughtful in our language, and work through things together if tough subjects come up. Approaching things in a trauma-informed way, again, with all people will help to create the brave space needed to be in community together, and get to a safe space if time and opportunity allows for some. So, a couple reflection questions for you. You don't have to share your answer now or at any time, but ponder these. How do you create space for people to bring up something that's uncomfortable in the work that you do or in the spaces that we're in? Is this something that you worked on or maybe seen modeled in a way that you find really effective? And then secondly, another question to think through is, let's say that you were the one who were on the receiving end of a microaggression. Thinking back to the video a moment ago, do you have a person or a safe or brave space where you can talk about this? If you don't feel comfortable talking to the person who harmed you, who can you talk to? As we think about these things, we definitely need to have each other's back when these things happen. And they're no doubt happening way more often than any of us realize. We all have a lot to learn, always. And if someone takes the time to share with you that you've offended them, consider it a gift and an investment in your relationship, and recognize that by sharing that, they're taking a risk. So really owning impact, taking some time to reflect as all. I know when I've committed microaggressions, I have, not proud of it, and it happens, right? A good thing, just the one thing that I try to practice is saying thank you, not asking someone to say it's okay because it's not. What I did wasn't okay. But if I didn't catch it, if I didn't realizing that, saying thank you for somebody being able to share that with me because it really means a lot. And I'm sure it takes a lot. That's a lot of labor on someone's end if you're on the receiving end of that to be able to share it. I see there's example in there as well. Sorry, some comments around cultural competency, humility, to practice. How do we apply these? We'll talk about some of that in just a moment. Absolutely, Ronald. I see too around peer support training. It's essential around learning how to become a safe space, thinking about self-reflection, because most of the time it's nothing to do with you, but about the person you're with. Yeah, thinking through how do we reflect on that? What are those spaces? Absolutely. So I know some examples have come through already, but let's think back to for general. But as you think back to Jay and a little bit about Jay's story, are there anything you can think about? This might be going too far back in time now, but are there some ways you might support Jay when it comes to safety, or anything you can think of maybe with the tenants that you work with specifically when it comes to promoting safety? Things that you might do, things that have worked well. Emotional intelligence. Yep. Listen to hear, not listen to respond. Oh my gosh. I love that, Joe. Thank you. Not chomping at the bit for a pause. Listen twice as much as you talk. Yep. It's a good measurement system. Yep. Humor when used appropriately. Love that caveat. Good in diffusing a tense situation. Yeah. Yeah, these are great. I'm thinking of an example I'm thinking of is like just the power of keys, like that visual representation and like physical representation as well of safety and choice. Thinking about how folks again can choose who to let into their home, who to let into their home, when they can come and go. All those again up to them, particularly for folks who may not have had that choice in quite a while. One of my favorite people a number of years ago that I worked with had a huge emotional release when she was given her keys. She was a survivor of domestic violence, and it had been a number of years, probably over a decade, since she'd been able to have any kind of agency over her body, her physical space. And for her, a key really signified that safety and choice and so much more. So she had a huge emotional release. It was a really powerful moment. Yep, seeing meeting people where they are, positive affirmations. Yep, fantastic. Compassion, great. Oh, these are great examples. Keep them coming. Thank you all so much. Next principle is trustworthiness and transparency. So I'm going to dig into that a little bit more. With this one, we think about, people really feel safe oftentimes when they know what to expect, and also that people are going to follow through. I think about how many times the folks you've worked with, maybe yourself, have been let down, maybe had trust broken, not been given the whole story or information up front so folks can make an informed decision about something or whether or not one might want to participate. Probably a lot. This has happened. So by creating that atmosphere of trustworthiness and transparency, we as service providers can really utilize that unconditional positive regard so that people we work with know that they can trust us, or hopefully we can earn that trust. We're going to have that follow through. There aren't going to be any gotcha moments that are going to come up. For those of you that are supervisors, I know Ari asked about that earlier. This is something critical to do with the folks that report to you as well, just all of us with each other. And then, thinking about this again in a housing and services context, important to let people know what's going to happen as much as we can. Taking an example of, like, let's say you have an upcoming meeting. What are you going to be talking about? What does the person you're working with want to talk about? Literally showing up to the meeting when it takes place. Maybe having some defined ways in which you work with someone, how they might want to be referred to, how you might want to be referred to, all those sorts of things. Really centering information on transparency, helping to really take away from that practice of power hoarding and really helping to reinforce and uplift an individual's agency so they can make their own decisions. Because so many times the folks that we're working with, maybe us as well, right? Maybe you as well, we've had that agency taken away. So really working to center that. Yes, strength-based modalities, some great examples being given in chat. So thinking again back to Jay, any other examples that you can think of when it comes to trustworthiness and transparency? Things that you might put that in place, or things that have helped quite a bit. Validating the pain and hurt. Yep. 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 Following through, 100%. Yeah, and one thing I think about is talking about how, like, let's say you were working with Jay to find a provider or something like that, like just knowing, like, hey, if this isn't a good fit, that's okay. Like, we can help find someone else. We can work together to find someone else, or I'll support you in finding someone else, whatever Jay would like to do, or the person you're working with would like to do. Ooh, 5 Ps. Proper preparation prevents poor performance. Ooh, love the acronyms. Yep, telling the truth. Yes. Oh my gosh, how often do we thinking about like very just like patriarchal? What's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, when we shield people from the truth, and it just takes away agency so much. That power hoarding is used not for good, even if it's intended that way. It doesn't go that way. Yep, people deserve to know what's happening when they're being discussed or when it's something that has to do with them. Yep, whoever the them is, we are, if something to do with us as humans, right? We need to know. Yep, patience, asking for feedback. Yep, yep, say what you mean what you say, and don't be mean when you say it 100%. And again, that consistency. Yeah, love this. So the next piece, as we think about this, is peer support. I know someone just gave some great examples of why peer support is so critical in chat. So find that, please share more as much as folks are able to, and hold that expertise. So speaking of, thinking about person-centered planning, honoring and lifting expertise, this principle, the third key principle of peer support, really, really is critical as part of that, a massive, massive value add to any team and a huge part of service provision. For me, when I mention the word peer, in this instance, I'm referencing folks with lived experience of homelessness or systems engagement. When working as a peer, oftentimes folks have a formal certification in peer support, but not always. That can sometimes vary by state or region or even agency or organization. And given this lived expertise that folks hold, peers not only start with a foot in the door as far as being able to connect to folks and build rapport, but also are able to offer suggestions and connection and expertise from the viewpoint of someone who's been in a similar situation, which can go a long way. Seeing a peer thrive can offer a window as well into someone's recovery. And I do mean recovery in a holistic sense, not necessarily or solely like a substance use sort of sense, though that might be a factor as well, depending on the individual. And conversations that might not happen with someone who hasn't been through the same thing often can take place more organically through peer support, because peer support really honors that lived experience for the unique and special value that it brings to any table. Um, yes, yeah, yep. Autumn is sharing that seeing client interactions completely shift when sharing your own lived experiences. Yep. Ooh, some great Contra Costa specific examples there. Making sure we don't offer things we can't deliver. Wonderful. Yeah, all the examples that folks have, anything you want to add, please do. I will openly share. I don't have lived experience, my own personal experience of homelessness and system involvement. So all the examples folks are able to give, just much, much appreciated, because I don't have any of my own to bring forward. But I have worked with peer support workers, brought folks in on teams, all of that, and it's just such an incredible, incredible value add. Again, so much differing expertise. I love it. Awesome. All right, so the next principle is collaboration and mutuality. So for this one, collaboration is really about, how you're going to work with a person in your program versus the collaboration that takes place with others in support of the individual. So mutuality, on the other hand, is when you do your best to level the power differences and share power in decision making. So this requires really having self-awareness of the impact of the identities you hold, specifically unearned power and privilege, and especially when you're working with folks who may not have the same unearned privileges that you do. Race is a good example of this. So for me, I identify as white, and solely because of that, I have to be cognizant of the fact that I don't have the experiences of institutional and systemic racism that many Black, Brown, or Indigenous folks may have, whether it's colleagues, supervisors, tenants, just folks in my life, right? And I sometimes forget about this and I don't think about it, which is also a huge point of privilege, right? Remembering and being aware is an ongoing practice. So some other unearned privileges. I think folks mentioned some of these earlier in the morning. Maybe gender or gender presentation. There's quite a few. So really critical to be quite aware of these privileges, while of course not assuming someone else's experience, as no group or identity is a monolith. Everyone's individual experience is unique, and the systems that you might seek to help someone work with in your efforts to collaborate also oftentimes have long histories of institutional and systemic racism. It can often be a source of trauma and activation. So thinking through all of this, how we choose to collaborate, how we choose to lean in, really, I think speaks to mutuality, which takes that conscious and intentional, just that intent, right? Genuineness and really that willingness to understand the dynamics of power in relationships. I see that there is a question and the hand raising feature isn't work. Yes, I'm glad to pause for a question. Go ahead, Michelle.
Hi, thank you
Of
for taking
course.
my question. I think, and you might be addressing this, but I just want to make sure if this will be a topic of discussion. With the trauma-informed approach, along with the realities of having to deliver hard messages about limited resources, particularly with housing and what people are facing, and sometimes there's some misinformation there about how some people are like, oh yeah, there's just this unlimited amount and there's lots of funding available and
Yeah.
you'll get a place right away. And so I think that's kind of hard, because that delivering messages like that can be very triggering and just another no. And that's a
Yeah.
hard one to deliver. So will that be discussed today? an approach of how to deliver tough news, which is
No,
pretty much.
yeah, no, that's a great question. I don't know that we have a section specifically set aside for it, but let's dig into it. We can dig into that now at the end. I'm so glad you raised that point. I think one person mentioned, and I'd be curious to know more about this. I know one person, a comment that's coming to mind from chat earlier is around not promising things you can't, not you specifically, but any of us not following,
Mhm.
promising things we can't deliver on, and just being upfront. Now, I'm curious, if you don't mind my asking a couple questions. Is this something where the folks who are looking for housing or services, was it tenants, clients who are receiving incorrect information first from someone else and then coming to you, and you're looking to say, hey, this isn't accurate, this isn't correct, here's the reality? Or is this something where, like, I'm curious a little bit more about the situation, if you don't mind
Mhm.
sharing.
Yeah, not me personally. I have more of an administrative
Hmm.
role.
Okay.
However, with our county partners who work with
Mm,
justice involved individuals,
yeah.
folks coming out of detention centers, I think there just might be just, I don't want to say misinformation, but there
Hmm.
seems to be some kind of confusion
Yeah.
in terms of what the reality is of what folks might have to maybe begin with at first
Hmm.
versus you know, being able to kind of initially just right away move into permanent housing because
Yeah.
there's
Hmm.
still the transitional component is still very much the route that many need to maybe perhaps begin with. And
Got
so
it.
I think it could just be challenging to have to kind of course correct providers who have to
Yep.
constantly course correct and
100%.
and they're right there trying to build that rapport and trying to get them
Yep.
access to other services. But when you hear no to something as impactful as housing,
Oh, yeah, it's
this,
painful.
yeah.
Hmm.
So thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you.
No, of course. I appreciate the question. I see too, folks agreeing or just having had similar experiences. It sounds like lots coming through in chat. I mean, one thing I'm thinking about, others continue to jump in, Ari as well, is I think if this hasn't been done already, I think having really clear um, kind of what's available, criteria for programs, all those sorts of things, as much as we can write that stuff down. I know that can be tricky and things change a lot, but as much as we can have that written down to be able to share, whether it's a pamphlet or information, so that people know, like, hey, I'm not just making this up. Like, I'm not making, I'm saying, I'm telling Ari it's this one piece of information and what's possible, and I'm telling a completely different thing to Michelle, because if that's the case, of course folks aren't going to trust me because I'm not being trustworthy. So having that written down that you can share not only with the individual who comes to you for services, but I'm thinking about some education you can provide, or organization. I don't know who the you is here, but education that can be provided to the organizations, the justice system, different folks that are sending folks over. If you know that it tends to come from a particular department or system or caseworker, name your person, place, or thing, um, to hopefully kind of prevent some of this on the upfront. Because yeah, that's ultimately I'm seeing things come through in chat as well. So much coming through that's just harmful to folks. Um, and then in terms of how to deliver those conversations, oh, that's a really hard one. I think just giving folks the full picture, giving folks the clear information. I know when I've had to have conversations like that before, I think sometimes too, I'll pause and say, I think sometimes when people make these promises, they really want them to be true. And you know what? I want a lot of things to be true as well. That doesn't mean they are true though. So I think there's good intent, but the impact is not the same. The impact is harmful. So I think being able to just give folks clear upfront information right away and say, I'm so sorry that this is what you were told. That's not correct. Let me talk through the ways that I can help you, really listening, really holding space, and really, like, just again being upfront and transparent right away and talking through. Um, I'm going to pause. Ari, is there anything you want to add? I'm seeing, trying to follow the chat questions as well, or comments. I'll stop talking.
No, I was just going to reiterate what you said. I think what you said was perfect too. Yeah, a lot of it is just that transparency up front, and being honest. And I think sometimes just saying, I don't know. Like some people are talking about the media, it's just like, oh, I've never heard that. Let me look into it, but not promising things you can't or making
Yeah.
things seem beyond what you
Yeah.
really know them to be. Yeah.
I love Jamie's comment as well around
Yeah.
holding space for people to be upset we can't deliver. And the message, I love this, Jamie. You're pointing out a very real issue in our system of care. I think that's one thing that's that can be, I think, a very human reaction sometimes, is to be very defensive, whether it's perhaps the person receiving news that they don't want to hear, which I would be as well. I'd be hurt, I'd be upset, I'd perhaps be defensive. And I think as a person working in the system, which is a broken system, right? We're all working in imperfect systems. It can be hard to hear that people are upset about the place you're working in, or that you don't have services. So again, I really point to Jamie's comment around holding space and like, yeah, it's not okay. I don't have a solution for you in this moment, and this isn't okay. Let me tell you what I can do. Let me tell you what I'm going to do from here, but just being really upfront. Yeah. Yeah. No, thanks for the question. Yeah. All right. I'm going to move us forward a little bit. I know we've got about 10 minutes left. Keep questions coming. So keep going. That was a really important one. So thank you all. Thank you, Michelle, specifically for that question. So for this one, we're not going to ask folks to share in chat. This is really just to think to yourself. But as we're thinking again about, power and privilege and proximity to power and all those sorts of things and where your own identities might lie, wanted to call out these two questions for you to think about. Again, just for yourself. Don't have to share in chat, but think about, in your life at work. Let's talk about at work. How close are you in proximity to power? And then secondly, for the second one, what proximity to power does the person or persons you're working with have? Now, this is going to likely vary by person. We cannot and should not speak for people, but we like to bring this question up and important because it's important to really consider this in a supportive housing context. Because simply by having a name badge, being an employee, it puts you in a position of authority, no matter what your title is. So as we think about, and it might change, right? Like who I am, who me, Kate, is at work, in the workplace, at a training, etc., is very different than who Kate is walking in the town that I live in, or at the grocery store, or things like that. Like there's proximity to power changes based on location sometimes as well. So just some things we like to bring up for folks to think about as they're delivering services, and thinking about choices and empowerment of folks around us who may not have had those choices before, or who might be thinking about the power that we do have. It's really, really critical. Which leads really to the next principle, which is, empowerment, voice, and choice. For this one, it always feels better when a person is able to make a choice. And I would argue that in almost every instance, providing even the smallest of choices is possible, even if your options are limited. Because a lot of times, as we've talked about today, tenants, clients haven't really had a lot of opportunity to have a say in what happens to them. And that could be anything from where they sleep, to when they eat, to the clothing options they have available, sometimes even what happens to their bodies. So by providing even the smallest of choices, we can help to bring back some dignity as well as agency to people. This particular principle I find can be a little bit overwhelming sometimes, especially, when we have different rules and regulations to abide by based on, funding, name your restriction. But most, I would say, if not all of the time, we can make some adjustments so that we can still achieve the same end goal, but by using a more trauma-informed path to get there. And then next, we're going to talk about, just again briefly, the sixth and final principle. So we've expanded this a little bit to be more specific, to look at culture, identity, and historical and generational trauma. Because a person's culture, identity, whether that be via gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, what's happened to them in the past, all of these things shapes who we are and how we interact with the world, as well as how the world interacts with us. And there's also the hidden trauma that was mentioned earlier, passed down from generation to generation, that if it stays if unresolved, can stay with people and continue to impact our worldview. So this particular principle is really about providing support that values cultural ways of knowing, healing, ways of connecting, being aware of racial, ethnic, and cultural needs of people, really recognizing the impact of historical trauma, and also recognizing too that the culture a person comes from influences how a person might ask for help, if they're going to ask for help at all, the language a person might use and how it's expressed, their family structure, their individual or group coping style, which one they might use. And these things are dynamic as well, and they change continually as they're influenced by both people's beliefs as well as the demands of their environment. So what's important here is really about practicing that culture of humility and approaching your work in an anti-oppressive way. And speaking of culture humility, which we've talked about and folks have brought up quite a few times today, I wanted to get on the same page about that and recognizing that really a critical component to being trauma informed is understanding individual differences in experiencing and recovering from trauma. So, culture humility is defined as a lifelong practice of self reflection and self critique, whereby the individual now only learns about another's, or excuse me, not only learns about another's culture, but one starts with an examination of their own culture, beliefs and cultural identities. So this is different than cultural competency. Again, it's not necessarily that one is bad and the other is good, but they are different. And I'll note also that while cultural competency is intended as a tool for addressing power dynamics, when measuring cultural competency, whiteness was often centered and used as the quote unquote norm. So cultural incompetence is framed as a lack of understanding or knowledge about the, again, using air quotes, other. So the focus is on learning about someone else's culture versus examining your own, versus whatever your culture may be and how you identify that. So with trauma-informed approaches, we really emphasize, starting within, doing your own homework and reflections about yourself, your own culture, kind of how you show up in the world, what shaped that approach. And with that, culture humility can come into play as you're thinking about how you show up in community with others as well. So key to that, approaching people and situations and really all things with curiosity and being willing to admit when you make a mistake, cause unintentional harm, things we've already talked about today. Because again, nobody's perfect. You're going to make mistakes. So explore your own biases. How we respond, address, and learn is really quite critical. And recognizing, again, people are going to experience trauma that is directly related to culture, which is where being aware of things like historical trauma, legacies of oppression, those sorts of things is really quite key in this work. And that these things, shift over time. Last note I'll make on this is that for me personally, I like the cultural humility frame for a lot of different reasons, including that, I can never be fully competent in somebody else's culture. It's enough work to figure out my own and all the ever shifting dynamics in my own life and how that just things that I hold and navigate. So framing this as humility and just approaching with curiosity feels a lot less pressure inducing and really I think allows almost a joyful and playful nature as well, just a personal way that I think about it for myself. And as you work to become a trauma-informed practitioner, centering anti-oppressive practices is really crucial. Many communities of color have organically engaged with trauma-informed approaches for millennia, so it's important to recognize that trauma-informed care, trauma-informed approaches, they aren't something new or something that was invented or institutionalized by organizations like SAMHSA. These practices really have been modeled in many communities for generations. So, as you work to affirm individuals and center anti-oppressive practices, really doing the work to learn about some of these practices and ensure that your approach includes the communities and voices of those who've often been excluded from conversations or are not honored for their work in this area or had their work co-opted without credit or acknowledgement. An example of this that comes to mind for me is the incredible work of the Black Panther Party when it comes to self and community care. Incredible stuff. So all these sorts of things, really, really important to acknowledge. And finally, and we'll have just a couple minutes for questions. As we close out our time together today, I wanted to leave you with three critical moves for being trauma informed. So first, reduce the harm of ongoing trauma wherever possible. Eliminate, reduce it. Um, try to reduce the impact of the experiences that are still occurring. Again, clearest example in the supportive housing context is assisting a person in exiting the traumatic state of literal homelessness by helping them move into housing. Second one is build resilience. You can't take away what's happened to people, but you can help a person and yourself to build resilience so that you might be less impacted by trauma to work through things. In a field like supportive housing, where both participants and staff are dealing with the impacts of trauma, this applies to everyone involved, not just the person receiving support or care. So really taking time to acknowledge and celebrate resilience. And then thirdly, it's not possible to provide an environment that will ensure that no one will ever have an experience that activates distressing memories or feelings or associations with past events, but it is both possible as well as respectful to structure environments in ways that make it less likely for this to occur as much as possible, and gives participants, tenants, clients, the power of choice over how and when they're reminded of and may want to work through their distressing experiences. All right, so question as we close out, and then we'll have some question for you, and then we'll have maybe a minute or two for Q&A. Is just curious, as we've spent this time together today, as you've given such great examples and asked great questions, What support or tools do you need to apply a trauma-informed approach to your work? And yes, please fill out a short survey. Thank you, Jamie, for putting that in the chat. Any thoughts folks have? And you can also just think about this question, maybe write it down and bring it up at a staff meeting next week, or talk about it with a colleague you feel safe with to have this kind of discussion.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I keep asking the questions.
No, it's
This is
okay.
Michelle.
Hi,
I'll try
Michelle.
to make it quick. I think one of the things that I'm wondering if there's any updated data as it relates to when an individual ends up having multiple assessments, especially around a short period of time, and so they're having to talk about these things over and over and over again. Is there any data out there that kind of can speak to that a little bit? And that's it. That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Data in terms of why it's not helpful or ways to work through it. What sorts of data are you thinking of? I'm not sure that I have an answer for you, but I'll see if I can get one.
Yeah, I think it's just, I guess, the possible negative impacts and sort of helping staff maybe get trained on ways to finesse that a little bit so
Yeah.
that it's less impactful, because sometimes it's repeated questions over and over again. So does that answer your question?
I think so. I have a thought. Ari, I think I heard you come off mute.
Yeah, just because you're not the first one to ask this, and this is on my to-do list actually. So I can say from the initial research I've done, I haven't found a ton about the impact of it. I just know, and Kate knows because I say this all the time, I'm a big proponent of data sharing because I feel like that is trauma informed for the reasons you said, right? Like someone shouldn't have to share their story 5 times to receive some basic services that we know everybody should receive. I'm a big proponent of that. That's obviously like a system level thing and very complicated. But ROIs and all that stuff, I always engage folks to think about. That's my spiel. But I am actually working on a training about that because we've been asked multiple times about that. So I've been doing some research. There's some practices out there, just like you said, on how to approach it, ask the questions. And a big thing I think as a former QI person, I could say is not always great, but just expanding the time at which it takes to fill those things out so people aren't forced to do it in like an intense 1-hour session.
Yeah.
I'm going to
Which we
watch
also
for that
know is not
training.
likely. I'll let you know.
Thank you.
And looking across your, what I don't know if it's within your organization, across the CoC, all those sorts of things. Like I know some organizations who have like sat down. I'd recommend this. Like sit down and look at like what are all the questions all the various departments, people, etc. ask of the folks that are coming to receive services or be housed in the like buildings or through subsidies that we have, and they've reduced or eliminated the redundancies for exactly the reasons that you and Ari are talking about. Because I don't know about you, but like for me, like if I tell Ari something that was really hard and like a deep dark secret for me to share, and then her coworker comes in and is like, "Hey, Kate, what about this?" I'm like, oh, it took me enough to tell Ari. I've been working with her forever. Like it can be very painful. So eliminating that and finding ways to talk about those things while respecting people's privacy, of course. Don't need to share all the things about all the people, but making sure that and getting permission from people when you do have conversations, like who can I share this information with, and then helping to reduce some of that, again, like having people come in with that informed, as someone mentioned in chat earlier with the doctor's office, like somebody who's read my file, like somebody who knows what's going on with me, so we can get a little quicker start. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. I know we've gone over and we still have some folks with us. Jamie, apologies, I keep talking. I will stop talking because you want to hop in and say any additional pieces.
No, you're great. Thank you both for a fantastic training. So we are going to send out to everyone the recording and actually to everybody that registered. So if your colleagues didn't make it, we're going to be posting the recording. We're going to be posting the learning guide, and we're going to send out the survey link to everybody in case you didn't get a chance to say anything. Didn't get a chance to provide your feedback. But again, thank you for a fantastic training, as always. Really, really appreciate it. And you all can see their contact information is there if you have any follow-up questions for them. But appreciate everyone coming in on a Monday.
Awesome. Thank you.